So now we're at the third wave, so we're getting closer here. I apologize, my bread maker's going on in the background. I hope that you can hear this okay. All right, so what we saw in the third wave, the 80s and the 90s, we saw a willingness to work with corporations to find solutions to environmental problems. So what I mean by willingness is, between environmental organizations and corporations especially. The Canadian Coalition on Acid Rain pushed for agreements between Canada and the US to reduce sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide emissions. This was huge legislation back in the day. The Great Lakes were getting really polluted, and so this was historic. These agreements that were ratified during that time. In 1983, the Green Party of Canada was founded. In 1988, James Hansen testified to the US Congress on the results of climate modeling. Hansen used three models ranging from business as usual, BAU is short for business as usual, to extreme emissions cuts. 10 years later, Patrick Michaels of the Cato Institute misrepresented Hansen's study before Congress in order to undermine progress on the Kyoto Protocol. One of the climate myths that we often hear is that Hansen's models were wrong. Well, he did three models so that he could show a range. All of his models did not come to fruition because they were each based on different premises. So yeah, out of three, only one came actually very close to the trajectory that we're on. So it's impossible for three models to be right if they're very different models. Duh. Anyway, you still hear this argument made by climate denialists. Hansen's models were wrong. No, they weren't. They were actually very close. Now, this is really important, James Hansen's modeling and the publicity that it received at the time, because this was the beginning of this kind of a rise in conscious awareness of climate change. And back in the late 80s, early 90s, it seemed like we were going to get some actual meaningful policy change on climate change. The Kyoto Protocol was a huge deal. It was the world working together. And, it was one thing after another changed that. There was a polarization and a partisanship that started to arise out of climate change versus climate denial. And a lot of this was led by industry. If you go out there, you'll be able to see that Exxon really led the charge in climate denialism. They knew that this was happening. They knew this back into, I can't even remember, I think the 70s. They were, major oil companies have deep pockets. And so they had some of the world's top scientists. So they knew that burning fossil fuels was causing problems in the atmosphere, and some of these scientists of these large multinationals were some of the first people to realize that this was a problem. And yes, this was obfuscated, and there's plenty of documentation surrounding that. So we'll be talking about that a little bit later. Anyway, since then, we've known this is a problem for so long, and yet here we are, finally, sort of, kind of, somewhat starting to talk about doing something significant about it. In the meantime, every single year, I think there was 1 year that global emissions didn't rise. And you have to think of this in terms of accumulation. Just because For example, during the pandemic, the rate of emissions lowered. That does not mean that emissions overall were lower. It means that the rate lowered. It slowed down. And because of how greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere, we have an accumulation. So we are still, accumulating on top of emissions that, were released in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s. This stuff doesn't go away, and that's a big part of the problem. It stays in our atmosphere. The majority of it stays in our atmosphere for centuries. And depending upon which greenhouse gas, of course, carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for centuries. And some of the other ones don't, but some of the other ones react in a more volatile way too. So this is pretty dangerous stuff that we're playing with. So we can talk more about that maybe the next time we meet in class.